At 5:23 a.m. on March 9, 1944, inside the freezing dispersal bay of RAF Hunsdon in Hertfordshire, Flight Sergeant Thomas "Tom" Ellery wiped a layer of frost from the cowling of a Beaufighter Mk6 as the first dull light of dawn crept across the field. The twin-engine heavy fighter was scheduled for a low-altitude sweep over the Dutch coast within the hour, and Ellery, a 28-year-old ground mechanic from Bristol, already knew something was wrong with its starboard Bristol Hercules engine. He had heard it the night before, a hesitation that lasted less than a heartbeat but long enough for his trained ear to stiffen. The pilot assigned to that aircraft, Flying Officer Raymond Carter, had simply shrugged, chalking it up to humidity or a minor magneto quirk. But Ellery had seen the logs and knew the truth. 3 aircraft from the same squadron, number 141, had suffered the same exact sputter under climb thrust in the past 2 months, and each of those failures had ended the same way, a mechanical fatality, written neatly in the report, as if a man's disappearance into the sea were a line item. Ellery was one of those mechanics who never asked for recognition and rarely received any. He had joined the RAF before the war, working on Gladiators and Blenheims, machines that barely resembled the heavy, temperamental beasts now entrusted to him. The Hercules engines were powerful, but their sleeve valve system, however innovative, had a habit of developing tiny inconsistencies in airflow under sustained torque. Officially, the manuals blamed pilot handling. Throttle application too abrupt, one factory note read. Excessive stress during turn and burn engagements, read another. Yet Ellery had spent too many cold nights with his hands buried inside those engines not to know that there was a subtler truth buried under the bureaucratic language. Something inside the induction manifold, something about how the mixture was delivered under lateral Gs, caused a momentary lean-out condition. It was small, invisible to most, but small things killed men. The war in early 1944 was in a strange transitional state. The Allies were planning the inevitable push across Europe, but German night fighter units were still relentless, and coastal flak remained deadly. Crews flew sortie after sortie in brutal conditions, and ground teams like Ellery's carried the weight of every engine cough, every hydraulic leak, every instrument that flickered at altitude. They remembered the names of the pilots who never returned. They remembered how they laughed, how they ate their rations, the music they liked, the letters they wrote home. For Ellery, one memory persisted more vividly than all the others. Sergeant Harris, a young man from Sacramento who used to talk endlessly about the American cars he hoped to buy after the war. Harris had gone down in the Channel 3 months earlier, when his Beaufighter lost power on the starboard engine during a defensive turn. The Board of Inquiry blamed pilot overcorrection. Ellery knew better. He had felt that same vibration in the metal days before the crash. He remembered Harris's grin in the mess hall the night before his last flight. That grin vanished every time Ellery opened the maintenance logbook. On this particular morning, the sputter in Carter's engine felt like the beginning of the same tragedy repeating itself. Ellery reported it, and the squadron officer glanced at him with sympathy but little intention to ground the aircraft. They were already undermanned for the day's operations, and the weather window was too narrow to delay. "Fine-tune the mixture control and runner-up," the officer said, the same phrase Ellery had heard a dozen times. Manuals, schedules, and pressures from above left no room for hesitation, even when hesitation meant life or death. And so Ellery crouched by the engine again, rubbing his palms together for warmth as he listened to the low rumble struggling for consistency. The problem, he suspected, wasn't the carburetor itself, but the short section of the induction elbow feeding the sleeve valve timing system. Under rapid throttle changes or aggressive bank angles, the airflow could momentarily surge or starve, and the Hercules did not forgive inconsistency. The factory insisted the design was sound. The field insisted otherwise. Somewhere between those two truths, Tom Ellery stood alone. He had already seen 3 funerals because of it. Carter, only 23 but already flying like a veteran, stopped by the aircraft and gave Ellery a nod. "If she's fit, he said, trying to sound confident. But Ellery caught something behind his eyes, a flicker of the same unease he had seen in other pilots who trusted their crew more than their instruments. They talked briefly, as they always did, about small things: the weather, the cold breakfast, the way the fog from the fields clung to the runway like a living thing. But Ellery's mind was elsewhere, tracing the path of the airflow inside the machine he had spent years learning to understand. The frustration that had been building since Harris's crash reached a breaking point. Reports ignored the pattern. Officers minimized it. The factory insisted it wasn't design-related. And yet Ellery had witnessed the same hesitation in every engine that later failed under stress. He had made notes, sketches, comparisons between returned wrecks and intact machines. There was one recurring flaw. The internal baffle plate inside the induction elbow seemed to flex slightly under certain vibration frequencies. A microscopic deflection, perhaps no more than a millimeter, enough to cause a lean surge at the worst possible moment. The fix, in theory, was simple. Reinforce the baffle with a small bracket or stiffener, a strip of metal no bigger than a man's finger. But modifying engine components without authorization was explicitly forbidden, punishable by court-martial in some cases. And yet Ellery could not stop thinking of Harris's empty bunk, of the letters that came back unopened, of the pilot who returned last week with his aircraft smoking, describing how the engine quit for half a breath before catching again. Half a breath was all it took for flak or a night fighter to end a life. As Ellery double-checked the spark leads and wiped oil from the cowling bolts, he realized that the war, with all its vast fronts, all its generals, all its machinery, often hinged on moments just like this. A mechanic, a machine, a hesitation measured in fractions of a second. No medal would ever be minted for what he was considering. No official record would acknowledge it. But if he didn't act, Carter might be dead by noon. The run-up test proved what he feared. At higher RPM, as the aircraft shook slightly on its chocks, the engine faltered for a blink. Carter noticed it too, lowering his goggles for a clearer look at Ellery. The officer in the tower signaled impatience. The sortie was set. Fuel had been loaded. The skies were clearing. The war machine was moving, and a single mechanic's concern had no place in its momentum. Ellery stood in the prop wash as the engine idled back down, his jacket flapping violently. He looked at the aircraft, at the pilot, at the horizon stained with the first hints of sunrise, and he made the decision that would define the rest of his life, a decision he would never fully confess to anyone. He would break the rules. But first he needed the hangar door closed, the tools laid out quietly, and the courage to act before anyone noticed. Ellery waited until Carter stepped away for the pre-flight briefing before he made his move. The hangar was nearly empty, only the distant hum of a generator and the slow drip of melting frost echoing through the cold steel structure. At 5:47 a.m., and with the dawn still more shadow than light, he wheeled the Beaufighter a few meters back under the eaves and quietly pulled the sliding door until it was almost shut. Only a narrow band of pale morning seeped through the gap, illuminating a single stripe across the concrete floor like a blade of light. It was enough to see, but not enough for anyone passing by to notice what he was doing. He opened the cowling and felt the familiar surge of heat rising from the engine block, still warm from the earlier test run. His fingers moved with the certainty of a man who had been living inside these machines for years, removing bolts in a rhythm, sliding panels free, exposing the induction elbow and the thin, dull-colored baffle plate inside it. To anyone else it would have looked like ordinary maintenance, but Ellery knew that what he was about to do stepped far beyond the boundary of authorized repairs. The RAF regulations were unforgiving on the subject of field modifications, especially to anything connected to airflow, fuel delivery, or ignition timing. The logic was simple. An engine failure caused by a sanctioned repair was acceptable. An engine failure caused by an unauthorized modification was negligence. Still, a regulation didn't have to look into the eyes of a pilot who trusted you, or write a letter to his parents. He retrieved a small strip of steel from his toolbox, barely the length of his palm, with 2 drilled holes and a slight curvature he had hammered into it over the past week. He had made it in secret, using spare metal cut from a damaged exhaust shroud. He hadn't known when he would dare to use it. Now, staring at Carter's engine, he knew the moment had arrived. His hands were steady, but his breath was shallow. He wiped sweat from his forehead, surprising himself. The hangar was freezing, but fear had its own temperature. Working quickly, he fitted the strip against the internal baffle, aligning it so it would brace the thin metal from flexing under vibration. He tightened the improvised bracket with 2 screws, each twist of the screwdriver sounding impossibly loud in the quiet hangar. He paused once when he heard footsteps outside and crouched behind the cowling like a man avoiding gunfire. But the footsteps faded, and he continued, heart pounding. The modification took only 13 minutes, but they were the most dangerous 13 minutes of his life. When he finished, he ran a finger along the reinforcement and felt its solidity. No more flex, no more momentary lean-out, or so he hoped. He reassembled the cowling, wiped the metal clean to remove the evidence of fresh contact, and reopened the hangar door just enough to look natural. It was 6 a.m. The briefing would end in minutes. He had done what he could. The moment Carter returned, Ellery forced himself into the role he knew well, the calm, invisible man who kept other men alive. Carter climbed into the cockpit, adjusting his harness and checking his instruments with the casual confidence of a pilot who trusted his ground crew implicitly. Ellery avoided eye contact. He wasn't sure he could mask the fear. When the starboard engine ignited and rose to a steady growl, Ellery felt the sound hit him physically, vibrating through his ribs. He leaned in, listening for the hesitation. The aircraft shook gently, warming, waiting. Seconds passed. The RPM rose. No cough, no sputter. The tone held steady. But he also knew the real test would come in the air, under torque, under stress. He stepped back, forcing himself not to dwell on what might happen if he had been wrong. By 6:21 a.m., the Beaufighter rolled toward the runway, joining the formation of aircraft preparing for the morning sweep. Mist still clung to the edges of the field, swirling around the wheels like smoke. Ellery stood at the edge of the dispersal bay watching the silhouettes line up in the dimness. He had seen hundreds of takeoffs during the war, but this one tore something inside him. He felt as though he were sending Carter into the sky with his own hands on the throttle. When the aircraft lifted off the ground, Ellery exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. But survival was not decided by takeoff. It was decided by what came after. The coastal sweep that morning would take the squadron into contested airspace patrolled by German FW-190s operating out of Leeuwarden and Dukuy. It was routine work on paper, but routine meant nothing in early 1944. Engines failed, flak bursts reached farther than expected, weather closed in unpredictably, and enemy fighters had a habit of appearing when confidence was highest. As he waited on the ground, Ellery replayed every moment of the previous hour. The hidden work, the screws, the strip of steel, the risk. He tried to distract himself by checking spark plugs on another aircraft, but his hands shook too visibly for him to pretend he wasn't terrified. At 7:58 a.m., and the first reports crackled over the wireless in the operations hut, the sweep had encountered enemy activity earlier than expected. A German coastal unit had scrambled fighters, and the Beaufighters had dropped to a lower altitude to evade tracking. Radio traffic was chaotic, clipped, tense. Words like engaged, break left, taking fire, and lost visual bled through the static. Then came a voice Ellery recognized instinctively. Carter's, calm but strained. Starboard's holding, engaging now. It was only a fragment, nearly swallowed by interference, but it burned into Ellery's memory. Starboard's holding. The words hit him like a blow. The engine hadn't failed at throttle up. It hadn't sputtered in the turn. It was responding cleanly, something it had never done before in those conditions. Ellery's hands froze over his toolbox, and he felt an almost painful surge of relief and dread intertwined. If it worked once, it might work again. If it failed later, the guilt would be his alone. The battle over the coast intensified. The squadron leader reported 2 FW-190s down. Another Beaufighter was limping back with damage. Carter's voice came through again, breathless now. She responds instantly, going after the second one. There it was, the moment Ellery had gambled everything for. A man's life preserved by a strip of metal that was never meant to be there. The Hercules engine pushed hard under a sharp climbing turn, should have hesitated. It didn't. Carter's aircraft surged, closed distance, and fired. Witnesses later described how the German fighter rolled violently before plunging into a column of smoke rising from the dunes below. The dogfight lasted less than 9 minutes, but for Ellery, it was an eternity. Radio silence followed. The ops room staff exchanged glances. Some aircraft were still unaccounted for. Ellery stood outside, staring at the horizon, gripping the edge of a fuel drum until his knuckles turned white. The airfield felt unbearably still. Then, faintly at first, the sound of engines emerged from the east. A formation, ragged but intact, approached. The first aircraft touched down, then another. Finally, at 8:41 a.m., Carter's Beaufighter crossed the runway threshold, wheels kissing the tarmac with a gentleness that seemed unreal after the violence of the morning. Ellery felt his breath break into something close to a sob, though he hid it with a cough. He watched Carter taxi toward the dispersal bay, shut down the engines, and climb out of the cockpit with a look that was equal parts triumph and disbelief. But it was the sentence he spoke, quietly, almost to himself, that Ellery would remember for the rest of his life. She never once faltered. Those 4 words confirmed everything. The forbidden fix had worked. The engine had survived not only the climb, but an entire battle. And yet the real consequences, the chain reaction, the whispers, the spreading curiosity about why Carter's aircraft felt different, were only just beginning. Carter barely had time to step down from the wing before two other pilots approached him, their faces tense with the charged energy of men who had just survived something they shouldn't have. One of them, Lieutenant Hargreaves, still had dried salt water on his flight suit where spray from a near sea-level evasive dive had soaked him. The other, Pilot Officer Neil Turner, carried a strip of shredded aluminum, a fragment of a 20mm shell that had torn through his left wing and somehow missed the fuel tank by inches. Both men spoke at once, asking what Carter had done differently, what made his aircraft pull up faster, why his engine didn't choke when everyone else's threatened to. Carter, exhausted and pale under the grime, simply said, "I don't know, but she felt eager today." He glanced over his shoulder at Ellery, who was walking toward the bowfighter with practiced calm, a rag in one hand and his toolbox in the other. Carter's eyes lingered on him longer than usual, as if something unspoken was passing between them. Ellery pretended not to notice, but a heaviness settled in his chest. Praise he could deflect. Suspicion he feared. As the adrenaline faded, the squadron's intelligence officer gathered debrief notes. Pilots described the same pattern. German fighters had committed aggressively, expecting the familiar lag in Allied heavy fighters. Instead, Carter's bowfighter had twisted into the attack with an almost uncanny immediacy. "He turned inside an FW-190, Turner said, not hiding his astonishment. "Inside. Since when can a bow do that?" A few pilots laughed, half in relief, half in disbelief, but the officer merely wrote the comment down, his pencil tapping the paper thoughtfully. Ellery kept his eyes lowered, kneeling by the engine, inspecting it with the deliberate thoroughness of routine work, but inside he felt the ground shifting. The moment the pilots described that impossible turn, the secret inside the cowling no longer felt like his alone. By midday, word had spread through the squadron like an unplanned rumor. Something whispered in corridors and half-open mess hall doors. Pilots compared notes. Mechanics exchanged glances. Officers tried to suppress the talk, but the story grew stronger precisely because no one knew what was different, only that something was. 2 hours later, an unannounced inspection team arrived from Group HQ, a pair of hard-eyed officers in immaculate uniforms who cared far more about rules than outcomes. They walked the flight line with clipboards, asking questions with voices that carried the authority of men who never faced gunfire, but whose signatures could end careers. When they reached Carter's aircraft, Ellery's heart thudded painfully. One officer ran a finger along the engine cowling, checking for unusual wear, leaks, or seams. "Pilot reports improved responsiveness," he said, reading from his notes. "We need to confirm no unauthorized adjustments were made." The words were neutral, but Ellery felt them like a blade resting across the back of his neck. He forced himself to answer in the calm, level tone he had cultivated for years. "Standard servicing procedures only, sir. Nothing outside the manual." The officer nodded, unimpressed or perhaps unconvinced. He scribbled something and moved on. But Ellery knew the truth. If they opened that induction elbow, everything would unravel. For the rest of the afternoon, he deliberately kept busy with other aircraft, keeping the reinforced engine out of sight. He worked in silence alongside his fellow mechanics, Barnes with his ever-present cigarette, Miller forever grumbling about cold metal, and Hughes, who had lost a brother earlier in the war, yet continued to show up each day with mechanical precision. Ellery trusted these men with everything except the secret now living inside Carter's engine. He noticed, however, that they were watching him more closely than usual. Men who understood machines deeply also understood when something had changed, and something had. That evening, as the light dimmed into a gray, damp twilight typical of early spring in Hertfordshire, Carter approached Ellery privately behind the hangar. His voice was soft, not accusatory. "Whatever you did," he said, "saved my life today, and maybe Turner's too. I felt it the moment I pulled into the climb. She answered me like she'd been waiting for the command. You don't get that from a tune-up." Ellery swallowed hard. The instinct to deny everything warred with the weight of Carter's gratitude. Finally, he said only, "Engines talk. Sometimes we just listen better." Carter studied him, as if weighing whether to press further. In the end, he simply placed a hand on Ellery's shoulder, a gesture of trust, not demand, and walked away. Ellery watched him disappear into the shadows and felt an unexpected ache in his chest. He had saved a life, but he had also crossed a line he could never uncross. The next morning, before he could fully ready himself for another day of tension, 3 pilots from a neighboring squadron arrived unannounced at the dispersal bay. One of them, Flight Lieutenant Morgan, had heard that 141 Squadron had an engine that didn't cough when diving out of a bank. His tone was half blunt curiosity, half desperate hope. His squadron had been losing aircraft to the same engine hesitation pattern for weeks. "Who worked on Carter's bow?" he asked. All eyes, of course, turned to Ellery. He felt exposed, as if someone had ripped open the floor beneath him. But something unexpected happened. Barnes stepped between them and shrugged in a convincingly dismissive tone. "Lucky engine, that's all. Sometimes you get one built on a Tuesday instead of a Friday." The pilots laughed, but their eyes lingered with suspicion. Mechanics rarely defended each other unless there was something to defend. After the pilots left, Barnes shot Ellery a sidelong glance. "Whatever you did," he muttered quietly, "you'd better make up your mind fast. Either undo it or teach the rest of us before the inspectors come sniffing again." Ellery froze. "Teach?" Barnes nodded. "You think you're the only one who's lost someone to that cursed hesitation? Harris was my friend too, remember?" His voice cracked on the name. "So don't you dare think you carry that weight alone." For the first time, Ellery felt the burden shift, not disappear, but spread across shoulders that understood. Still, fear gnawed at him. If one man breaking regulations was bad, 4 men doing it was a conspiracy. Punishment wouldn't just be discharge, it would be disgrace. Yet one look at the faces around him, men who had wiped blood from cockpit floors, patched bullet holes at midnight, and watched aircraft vanish into the sea, and he knew the truth. They would risk their careers without hesitation, if it meant keeping pilots alive. Night fell early, as it often did. The air smelled of cold earth and machine oil. A faint fog rolled across the taxiway like a ghostly tide, and it was in that quiet hour, under the yellow glow of a single work lamp, that Ellery finally broke his silence. He opened the cowling and showed the others what he had done. No speeches were made. No pact was sworn. They simply stood there, 4 men staring at a sliver of metal so small and insignificant that it seemed absurd to attribute any salvation to it. And yet they all understood immediately. The simplicity of it, the elegance, the necessity. Miller was the first to speak. "I can make 3 more by dawn." Hughes nodded. "Dispersal crews swap panels before inspections anyway. We'll hide them when needed." Barnes cracked his knuckles, the gesture of a man ready for a fight. "If HQ wants the engines failing again, they'll have to do it over my dead body." Ellery felt something inside him settle. Not relief. The danger was now far greater than before, but resolve. He was no longer alone. For the next 2 nights, the dispersal bay became a clandestine workshop. Under the guise of routine winterizing repairs, they produced 6 reinforced baffle brackets. The soft ring of hammers, the rhythmic rasp of filing metal, and the muted click of screws turning became the soundtrack of their rebellion against a deadly flaw that no one in authority seemed willing to confront. They worked with a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and quiet determination, knowing every minute brought them closer to discovery. But the alternative, doing nothing, was no longer tolerable, because men kept dying, because the manuals kept lying, because someone had to choose the truth over the rules. And Ellery realized as he watched his fellow mechanics work by lamplight that the small forbidden fix he had created, born of grief, desperation, and defiance, was no longer just a modification. It was becoming a movement. By the end of March 1944, the change was undeniable. Bowfighters from 141 Squadron were returning with fewer mechanical failures, tighter turning performance, and a kind of confidence the pilots themselves struggled to describe. Reports began noting improved responsiveness during torque-heavy maneuvers, particularly on aircraft maintained by Ellery's dispersal crew. But the numbers alone told the story more clearly than any pilot ever could. Fewer aborted missions, fewer emergency landings, fewer letters home explaining why someone wouldn't be coming back. Yet the danger of discovery grew each day. The reinforcement plates had to be concealed during inspections, removed and reinstalled with the precision of a watchmaker's hands. More than once, a visiting officer lingered near an open engine just long enough to make every mechanic in the hangar feel their heart hammering against their ribs. The unspoken rule became simple. If anyone in authority approached, someone would cough loudly, the signal to shut panels and return to authorized maintenance. Inside the squadron, however, word spread in the way truths always do. Quietly, person to person, through trust rather than orders. Mechanics from other units began drifting into the hangar after dusk, pretending to borrow tools or ask about fuel mixture settings. Their real purpose was clear the moment they saw the way Ellery's men formed a protective wall around Carter's aircraft. They wanted to know the secret. They wanted the same impossible turn, the same seamless throttle response, the same defiance of the engine's deadly hesitation. Ellery hesitated at first, fearing a wider circle would increase the risk of exposure, but the memory of Sergeant Harris, and of so many others, pushed him past fear into something deeper. He showed the modification to the first visiting mechanic. Then another. Then another. Within a week, reinforced baffles began appearing on aircraft across the wing, hidden beneath factory paint and silence. The enemy noticed. German pilots had long counted on the faint lag in Allied heavy fighter response. Their tactics depended on it. Dive hard, force the bow into a turn, wait for the cough, then strike. But suddenly, the cough never came. Instead, the bow fighters were beginning to cut inside German attacks, slipping under firing arcs with an agility that made seasoned Luftwaffe aces curse over their radios. One prisoner of war later admitted that intelligence units suspected the British had upgraded the Hercules engines with a new supercharger stage. They called it a ghost improvement, something that appeared out of nowhere. They were close to the truth, but not quite. In mid-April, during a routine maintenance review, an inspector from the Air Ministry finally spotted a bracket on an aircraft whose crew had forgotten to remove it before inspection. The hangar froze as if every man inside had turned to stone. The inspector frowned, tapped the metal with the back of his pen, and asked, "What the devil is this?" Ellery stepped forward. He expected a court-martial. He expected his career, his reputation, and perhaps even his freedom to evaporate then and there. But instead of confessing, he explained, calmly, clearly, and with more conviction than he had ever spoken in his life, that this tiny reinforcement had prevented at least 6 engine failures, 2 crashes, and countless pilot deaths. He described the field reports, the hesitation under torque, the pattern of losses, the flaw that the manuals refused to acknowledge. The inspector listened in silence. When Ellery finished, the man exhaled slowly and said only, "Show me." They pulled the cowling, walked through the airflow path, demonstrated the vibration points, and replayed, with machine-like clarity, the physics of failure and the logic of the fix. The inspector took notes, asked questions, made no comment on legality. When he left the hangar, every mechanic felt the air grow heavier, uncertain whether they had saved themselves or doomed the entire unit. 3 days later, the official response arrived, not as punishment, not as reprimand, but as an order, effective immediately. All Hercules-powered aircraft are to receive reinforced induction baffles, field modification to be standardized until updated factory parts are issued. There was no mention of Ellery, no mention of Barnes, Miller, Hughes, no mention of Carter's fight above the coast or the night spent bending metal under dim lamps. The Air Ministry simply adopted the change, quietly and efficiently, as if it had been their idea all along. This was how war remembered people like Ellery. Indirectly through improved statistics and revised protocols, never through medals or speeches. When the war ended, he returned to Bristol, married a woman who worked in a factory that built bicycle frames, and raised 2 daughters who barely knew he had once fought the war not with a rifle, but with a wrench and a stubborn refusal to let young men die for a flaw no one wanted to see. He worked as a mechanic until his hands stiffened with age, fixing lorries and tractors with the same gentleness he once gave to war machines. He never spoke about the bracket, never claimed credit, never corrected the official histories that later attributed the improvement to ongoing engine refinements. But every year on the anniversary of Harris's crash, Ellery would walk alone to a quiet hill overlooking the city and stand there for several minutes, as if counting the names of men who never made it home. Some stories never appear in textbooks, some heroes never wear uniforms with ribbons, and some victories, the quiet ones, the invisible ones, begin with a single mechanic who refuses to accept that a flaw must remain a flaw simply because the manual says so. If you found this story buried in an old archive, you might think it too small to matter. But wars are not won only by factories or generals. They are won by men like Ellery, who saw a problem up close and acted before anyone granted them permission to save a life. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of that forbidden fix. A sliver of metal in an engine no one believed could change the course of anything, carrying across the decades like a whisper from a forgotten hangar.